Lee was a fighter. In crisis, when all seemed hopeless, he was ferocious, endlessly resourceful, firm in his resolve, and steadfast in advancing his cause. And thus he saw us through many battles. The battle for merger against the communists, which most people thought the non-communists would lose. The fight when we were in Malaysia against the communalists when his own life was in danger. Separation, which cast us out into a hazardous world. And then the withdrawal of the British military forces from Singapore, which threatened the livelihoods of 150,000 people. Because he never wavered, we didn't falter. Because he fought, we took courage and fought with him and prevailed. And thus, Mr. Lee took Singapore and took us all from the third world to the first. In many countries, anti-colonial fighters and heroes would win independence and assume power, but then fail at nation building. Because the challenges of bringing a society together, growing an economy, patiently improving people's lives are very different from the challenges of fighting for independence, mobilizing crowds, getting people excited, overthrowing a regime. But Mr. Lee and his team succeeded at nation building. Just weeks after separation, Mr. Lee boldly declared that 10 years from now, this will be a metropolis. Never fear. And indeed, he made it happen. He instilled discipline and order, ensuring that in Singapore, every problem gets fixed. He educated our young. He transformed labor relations from strikes and confrontation to tripartism and cooperation. He campaigned to upgrade skills and to raise productivity, calling this effort a marathon with no finish line. He enabled his economic team, Goh Keng Swee, Hon Swee Sen, Lim Kim San, to design and carry out plans to attract investments, grow the economy, and create prosperity and jobs. As he said, I settled the political conditions so that tough policies could be executed. However, Mr. Lee was also clear that while the development of the economy is very important, equally important is the development of the nature of our society. So he built an inclusive society where everyone enjoyed the fruits of progress. Education became the foundation for good jobs and better lives. HDB new towns sprung up, one after another. Queenstown, Tua Payoh, Ang Mo Kio, to be followed by many more. We had roofs over our heads, and we became a nation of homeowners. With Mr. Devon Nair and the NTUC, he transformed the union movement into a positive force, cooperating with employers and with the government to improve the lot of workers. Mr. Lee cared for the people whom he served, the people of Singapore. When SARS struck in 2003, he worried about taxi drivers whose livelihoods were affected because tourists had dried up, and he pressed us hard for ways to find ways to help the taxi drivers. Mr. Lee also cared for the people who served him. One evening, just a few years ago, he rang me up. One of my mother's WSOs, women security officers, was having difficulty conceiving a child, and he wanted to help her. And he asked me whether I knew how to help her to adopt a child. So Mr. Lee was concerned for people not just in the abstract, but personally and individually. Internationally, Mr. Lee raised Singapore's standing in the world. He wasn't just a perceptive observer of world affairs, but a statesman who articulated Singapore's international interests and enlarged our strategic space. At crucial turning points, from the British withdrawal east of Suez to the Vietnam War to the rise of China, his views and counsel influenced thinking and decisions in many capitals. In the process, he built up a wide network of friends in and out of power. He knew every Chinese leader from Mao Zedong and every US president from Lyndon Johnson. He established close rapport with President Suharto of Indonesia, one of our most important relationships. Others he knew included Deng Xiaoping, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Schmidt, George Shultz, as well as President Bill Clinton and Henry Kissinger, who we are honored to have here with us this afternoon. They all valued his candor and his insight. As Mrs. Thatcher said, Mr. Lee had a way of penetrating the fog of propaganda and expressing with unique clarity the issues of our time and the way to tackle them. He was never wrong. And hence, despite being small, Singapore's voice is heard, and we enjoy far more influence on the world stage than we have any reason to expect. Mr. Lee didn't blaze this path alone. He was the outstanding leader of an exceptional team, a team which included Goh Keng Swee, S. Rajaratnam, Osman Wok, Hon Sui Sen, Lim Kim San, Toh Chin Chai, Ong Pang Boon, Devan Nair, and quite a number more. They were his comrades, and he never forgot them. So it's very good that Mr. Ong Pang Boon is here today with us to speak about Mr. Lee later on. Thank you, Mr. Ong. Mr. Lee received many accolades and awards in his long life, but he wore them lightly. When he received the Freedom of the City of London in 1982, he said, "I feel like a conductor at a concert, bowing to applause, but unable to turn around and invite the accomplished musicians in his orchestra to rise and receive the ovation for the music they have played." For running a government is not unlike running an orchestra, and no prime minister ever achieves much without an able team of players. Because he worked with a strong team and not alone, because people knew that he cared for them and not for himself, and because he had faith that Singaporeans would work with him to achieve great things, Mr. Lee won the trust and confidence of Singaporeans. The pioneer generation who had lived through the crucial years had a deep bond with him. I once met a lady who owned a successful fried rice restaurant. She told me, "Tell Mr. Lee Kuan Yew I will always support him. I was born in 1948, and I'm 48 years old. The year was 1996. There was some issue then, and this question had come up. I know what he has done for me and Singapore." She and her generation knew that, to use a Chinese phrase, 跟着李光耀走，不会死的. If you follow Lee Kuan Yew, you will survive. Mr. Lee imbued Singapore with his personal traits. He built Singapore to be clean and corruption-free. His home was Spartan, his habits were frugal. He wore the same jackets for years and patched up the worn bits instead of buying new ones. He imparted these values to the government, and even when old and frail, on his 90th birthday, when he came to Parliament and MPs celebrated his birthday in Parliament, he reminded them that Singapore must remain clean and incorruptible, and that MPs and ministers had to set the example. He pursued his ideas with tremendous and infectious energy. He said of himself, "I put myself down as determined, consistent, persistent. I set out to do something, I keep on chasing it until it succeeds. That's all. Easy to say, very few do it. And this was how he seized opportunities, seeing and realizing possibilities that many others missed. So it was he who pushed to move Paya Lebar Airport to Changi. It was he who rejected the then conventional wisdom that MNCs were rapacious and exploitative, and he wooed foreign investments from MNCs personally to bring us advanced technology, to bring us overseas markets, to create for us good jobs. He wasn't afraid to change his mind when a policy was no longer relevant. When he saw that our birth rates were falling below replacement more than 30 years ago, he scrapped the stop at 2 policy and started encouraging couples to have more children. Having upheld a very conservative approach to supervising our financial sector for many years, he eventually decided the time had come to rethink and liberalize, but to do so in a controlled way. And this was how Singapore's financial center took off in a new wave of growth to become what it is today. He was always clear what strategy to follow, but never so fixed to an old strategy as to be blind to the need to change course when the world changed. Nothing exemplifies this better than water security, which was a lifelong obsession of his. He entrenched the PUB's 2 water agreements with Johor in the separation agreement. He personally managed all aspects of our water talks with Malaysia. He launched water-saving campaigns. He built reservoirs. He turned most of the island into water catchment to collect the rain, to process, to use. He cleaned up the Singapore River and Kallang Basin. He dreamed of the Marina Barrage long before it became feasible and persevered for decades until finally technology caught up and it became feasible and it became a reality. And he lived to see it become a reality. When PUB invented new water and desalination became viable, he backed these new technologies enthusiastically. So the result today is Singapore has moved towards self-sufficiency in water, become a leader in water technologies, and turn a vulnerability into strength. So perhaps it's appropriate that today, for his state funeral, the heavens opened and cried for him. Greening Singapore was another of his passions. On travels, when he came across trees or plants that might grow well here, he'd collect saplings and seeds and hand-carry them back home. He used the Istana grounds as a nursery and would personally check on the health of the trees, not just in general, but individual, particular trees. If they had names, he would know their names. He knew the names of the scientific names. Singapore's Prime Minister was also the chief gardener of the city in a garden. He had a relentless drive to improve and continued to learn well into old age. At 70, to write his memoirs, he started learning how to use his computer. Every so often, he would call me for help, sometimes late at night, and I would give him a phone consultation and talk him through the steps, how to save a file, how to find a document which has vanished somewhere on his hard drive. And if he couldn't find me, he would consult my wife. He made a ceaseless effort to learn Mandarin over decades. He listened to tapes of his teacher talking, conversing with him every day, in the morning while shaving at home, in the evening while exercising at Street Temasek. And he kept up his Mandarin classes all his life. Indeed, his last appointment on the 4th of February this year, before he was taken gravely ill early the next morning, was with his Mandarin tutor. He inspired all of us to give of our best. and he was constantly thinking about Singapore. At one National Day rally in 1988, he declared, "Even from my sickbed, even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel something is going wrong, I will get up." And he meant that. Indeed, even after he left the cabinet, occasionally he would still raise with me issues which he felt strongly about. During the budget debate 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, MPs hotly debated the cost of living, public transport, and so many other matters then preoccupying Singaporeans. Mr. Lee felt we had lost sight of the fundamentals that underpinned our survival. He emailed me. He sent me a draft speech. He told me he wanted to speak in the chamber to remind Singaporeans of these unchanging, hard truths, what our survival depended upon. But I persuaded him to leave the task to me and my ministers, and he took my advice. But his biggest worry was that younger Singaporeans would lose the instinct for what made Singapore tick. And this was why he continued writing books into his 90s. Bilingualism, hard truths, one man's view of the world, and at least one more guided by him, still in the process of being written, on the history of the PAP. Why did he do this? So that a new generation of Singaporeans could learn from his experience and understand what their security, prosperity, and future depended upon. One of Mr. Lee's greatest legacies was preparing Singapore to continue beyond him. He believed that the leader's toughest job was ensuring succession. So he systematically identified and groomed a team of successors. He made way for Mr. Goh Chok Tong to become Prime Minister after him, but stayed on in Mr. Goh's cabinet to help the new team succeed. He provided stability and experience and quietly helped to build up Mr. Goh's authority. He knew how to guide without being obtrusive, to be watchful while letting the new team develop its own style, its own authority. He described himself like a mascot, but everyone knew how special this mascot was and how lucky we were to have such a mascot. And it was likewise when I took over. Mr. Goh became Senior Minister, Mr. Lee became Minister Mentor, a title which he felt reflected his new role. Not in command, but advice not to be taken lightly. Increasingly, he left policy issues to us, but he would share with us his reading of world affairs and his advice on major problems which he saw over the horizon. Some other prime ministers told me that they couldn't imagine what it was like to have two former PMs in my cabinet. But I told them it worked, both for me and for Singapore. For all his public duties, Mr. Lee also had his own family. My mother was a big part of his life. They were a deeply loving couple. She was his loyal spouse and confidant, going with him everywhere, fussing over him, helping with his speeches, and keeping home and hearth warm. They were a perfect team and wonderful parents. When my mother died, he was bereft. He felt the devastating loss of a lifetime partner, who, as he said, had helped him to become what he was. My father left the upbringing of the children largely to my mother, but he was the head of the family and he cared deeply about us, both when we were small and long after we had grown up. He wasn't very demonstrative, much less was he touchy-feely. So not new age, but he loved us deeply. After my first wife, Ming Yang, died, my parents suggested that I try meditation. They gave me some books to read, mindfulness, tranquility meditation. I read the books, but I didn't make much progress. I think my father had tried meditation too, also not too successfully. His teacher told me later that when he told Mr. Lee to relax, still his mind and let go, he replied, "But what will happen to Singapore if I let go?" When I had lymphoma, he suggested that I try meditation more seriously. He thought it would help me to fight the cancer. He found me a teacher, spoke to him personally, and with a good teacher to guide me, I made better progress. In his old age, after my mother died, my father started meditating again, and this time with help from Kok Song, whom he knew from GIC. Kok Song brought a friend to see my father. The friend was a Benedictine monk who did Christian meditation. My father was not a Christian, but he was happy to learn from a Benedictine monk. And he even called me to suggest that I meet the monk, which I did. He probably felt I needed to resume meditation too. And to give you some context, this was a few months after the 2011 general election. I was by then nearly 60, and he was by then nearly 90. But to him, I was still his son to be worried over, and to me, he was still a father to love and appreciate, just like when I was small. So this morning, before the ceremonies began at Parliament House, we had a few minutes. I sat by him and meditated. Of course, growing up as my father's son could not but mean being exposed to politics very early. I remember as a little boy, I knew his constituency was Tanjong Pagar. I was proud of him becoming legal advisor to so many trade unions, and I was excited by the hubbub at Oxley Road whenever elections happened and our home became the election office. I remember when we were preparing to join Malaysia in the early 60s, going along with my father on constituency visits, the Fang Wen tours, which he made to every corner of Singapore. For him, it was back-breaking work, week after week, every weekend, rallying the people's support for a supremely important decision about Singapore's future. For me, these were not just Sunday outings, but also an early political education. I remember election night in 1963. The crucial general election when the PAP defeated the pro-communist Barisan Sosialis. My mother sent me to bed early, but I lay awake in bed to listen to the election results until the PAP had won enough seats to form the government again. And then I think I fell asleep. I remember the day he told me, while we were playing golf at the Istana, that should anything happen to him, he wanted me to look after my mother and my younger brother and sister. I remember the night the children slept on the floor in my parents' bedroom at Temasek House in Kuala Lumpur, because the house was full of ministers who had come up from Singapore. And every so often, my father would get up from bed to make a note about something before lying down to rest again. But obviously, he wasn't asleep. And the date was 7th of August, 1965, 2 days before separation. Growing up with my father, living through those years with him, made me what I am. This year is the 50th anniversary of Singapore's independence. We all wanted Mr. Lee to be present with us on August the 9th to celebrate this milestone. More than anybody else, it was he who fought for multiracialism, which ultimately led to our independence as a sovereign republic. It was he who united our nation, built our people, built a nation, and made our 50th anniversary worth celebrating. Sadly, it is not to be. But we can feel proud and happy that Mr. Lee lived to see his life's work come to fruition. At last year's National Day Parade, when Mr. Lee appeared and waved, and it appeared on the big screen on the floating platform, the crowd gave him the most deafening cheer of the whole parade. Last November, the People's Action Party celebrated its diamond anniversary at the Victoria Concert Hall, where Mr. Lee founded the party 60 years ago. Party members were so happy to see that Mr. Lee could be there. They gave him a rousing, emotional, standing ovation. Those of us who were there will never forget it. St. Paul's Cathedral in London was built by Sir Christopher Wren, a famous architect. He was the architect of the cathedral, and he's buried in the cathedral, which was his masterpiece. There's a Latin epitaph on his grave, and it reads, Si monumentum requiris circumspice. It means, if you seek his monument, look around you. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew built Singapore. To those who seek Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's monument, Singaporeans can reply proudly, look around you. Now let me continue in Malay and then Mandarin. Saudara-saudari setanah air, kita kehilangan seorang tokoh yang telah memimpin kita, menjadi sumber inspirasi kita, menyatupadukan kita, dan merintis kejayaan kita. Ini termasuk keharmonian
各位，李顯龍啦喺悼詞裏面提到，形容今個禮拜啦就係一個黑暗嘅一週嚟形容新加坡，因為啦佢爸爸李光耀病逝。咁佢爸爸啦喺受到日軍佔據嘅時期嘅生活經驗啦，令到佢更加想爭取自由獨立嘅意願。咁另外啦，佢都提到唔少李光耀嘅政績。咁佢話啦，爸爸建立咗新加坡為一個多元化嘅國家。咁除咗咧係宗教自由、雙語政策之外啦，亦都係有唔少嘅基礎價值。咁民眾對李光耀咧係有充分嘅信任㗎。佢讚賞李光耀咧係一個出色嘅演講家，識得多種嘅語言，咁同時都係一個嘅戰士，實現咗新加坡同埋馬來西亞合併，而最終咧都脫離咗馬來西亞聯邦，徹底獨立，更加咧成功建設咗一個國家，提升咗新加坡嘅國際地位，喺經濟同埋社會上咧都攞得咗好大嘅貢獻㗎。佢形容爸爸一生咧就好似馬拉松咁，從來咧都冇停過嚟，咁更加係熱衷學習，咁好似咧學習點樣去用電腦。佢都好關心任何一個喺佢身邊共事嘅人，咁甚至咧係一個的士司機。咁佢又話啦，李光耀同多國嘅領袖建立咗深厚嘅友誼，咁包括係中國前領導人鄧小平，咁並展出鄧小平嘅政績啦，令到佢爸爸咧係擴闊咗視野㗎。而佢都提到啦，2年前啦，係曾經咧係爸爸認為國家咧係行錯咗方向，係想咁樣咧嚟發表演講。咁另外啦，佢喺家庭方面，佢話啦，爸爸李光耀同埋媽媽柯玉芝啦，係大家相愛住大家，亦都咧係一對好好嘅父母。咁而媽媽死後啦，對李光耀嘅打擊咧，亦都係好大㗎。咁爸爸曾經答應過佢要同癌症去鬥爭，一直以嚟啦，無論喺生活上同埋從政上面啦，都教導住佢，亦都曾經囑咐過佢啦，希望係由佢照顧媽媽、弟弟同埋妹妹。李顯龍話咧，係會以爸爸為榮，亦都話咧，同爸爸經歷嘅所有嘢咧，係造就咗今日嘅自己。
新加坡的發展和成功，跟建國總理李光耀先生的個性和理想有着密不可分的關係。
現場嘅情況啦，先睇到呢一度。咁而家啦，我哋睇翻中午李光耀靈柩移送儀式嘅情況咧。